I'm so glad to be here with everyone. And I will, yes, please, I will take this seat and you there. Yes, so just a little short reflection on this panel and the name of it. Because we see that to address the challenges of climate change, but also the bigger picture of humans eroding the biosphere, Mary referred to the study that came on Monday, the IPBES Global Assessment of Biodiversity. So this panel aims to have a dialogue. What is it that we need to change in order to create a new relationship with nature? And I actually listened in to the media launch of this IPBES report yesterday, and I was pleased to see how much the co-authors of this really emphasized the systemic view, the fabric of life. They got questions from journalists about, yeah, but where are the numbers? Or what was the most pressing issue? And they were like, it's the fabric of life. It's the interconnectivity. It's the connections. And that's profound. Like you said, Mary, it's something to celebrate and something that's also hard. But I feel like the research world is really bringing forth the message of connectivity as well, in at least the research from this perspective. And that leads me to just say who I am. My name is Louise, Hård of Segerstad. I work at Albaeco, and we're an NGO working with research communication, but we're also engaged in this conference because you feel that we need this additional perspective. But now over to our amazing panel. So we have Margil, that you already met, one of the experts of nature's rights. We have AnnaKarin Hammar, who is a reverend and doctor of theology in the Church of Sweden. And we have Johansson, you have a PhD in human ecology, but you're not in academia anymore. And I suggested to Per, can I sort of introduce you as an intellectual, existential jack of all trades? And he said, yeah, that's what I am. And if you read the program, we had planned to have Parul Sharma on this panel. Unfortunately, she had to cancel due to family. No, you lost. Jag satte på den igen. Den är röd. Den är röd. Den skulle vara röd när den var på. Ja, vi gör så. So Parul is a lawyer who works with human rights in business. And then our plan was to have a broad discussion about how nature's rights can come into business, spirituality, academia. But since Parul isn't here, we will now focus a little bit more in depth into spirituality and religion in general, and Christianity more specifically, since we have AnnaKarin here. So, with this introduction, I will ask the panel to give an initial reflection on if or how our religious institutions can contribute to make Earth rights a solution whose time has come. AnnaKarin, would you like to start?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. I think it's wonderful to find a community of people caring for the Earth community. And that is such a powerful movement across countries of affirming the rights of nature and the right to existence for all our Earth community. What resources can we find in Christian tradition for caring for the Earth, for the rights of nature? What resources can we find? Let me lift 3 resources that I have found. The first one is that the church never stopped to sing. The disenchantment of the world with the enlightenment and with the modernity did not affect all of worship. In liturgy, we groan with creation. In liturgy, we praise a cosmic praise of the universe with God. And we believe that God is present in everything, in the river, in the sparrow that falls to the ground, in the human being. And together in worship we unite in cosmic praise and in cosmic groaning. The disenchantment of the world never stopped in liturgy. That's the first resource, liturgy. The second resource in Christian tradition is the notion of creation. Creation is different from the word nature and the word environment. In nature, the human being stands here and nature is there. It's a dualistic thinking. In environment, it's the same thing. The human being is separate and the environment is what is all around. But in the theological notion of creation, it's originally an inclusive notion. Also the human being is included. We are creation and we are part of creation. And in religious tradition, we also think that God is part of creation. God is greater than creation, but God is also present everywhere in creation, what we today sometimes call panentheism. So the notion creation is a wonderful idea to bring back the interconnectivity of all that exists. And the third one is Holy Communion. Holy Communion is celebrating all that exists together. Reveal to us the mystery of your baptism, one water and one communion of life. I wrote in my dissertation on baptism, which is called The Mystery of Creation, the Sacrament of Creation. Holy Communion is not confined to baptism, is not confined to Eucharist. It's a cosmic Holy Communion.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, please, Per.
Okay, yes. I find actually that I have to struggle somewhat to find my voice here because I'm quite moved already by the ambience and commitment present in this room. Let me not exactly comment on what AnnaKarin just said, but personally I'm not particularly concerned with religious institutions or even religious traditions as such. I prefer a more direct philosophical or even personal approach, and I could express it very briefly like this in philosophical terms, that I regard nature and spirit as two faces of the same reality. So the separation, the conceptual separation between spirit and nature, or between mind and body, or between thinking and acting, if you will, is literally an artificial separation. And that is something I have delved into as an academic researcher. How did this separation occur and manifest itself historically? And how could we get beyond it? Because to me it's completely unrealistic. And there's a very interesting, if you put your thought hat on, it's a very interesting question. How can something that is actually really not realistic exist? How can something that isn't true to how things really are come to be? To me, that is a sign that there is something very deeply wrong with our general way of thinking. We are much more infected, if you will, by this a kind of delusion. An earlier speaker here spoke in terms of a delusion, and I think that's a very correct term, actually. And to make a jump here now in thinking, to me this has also very much a lot to do with the anthropocentric view of reality, which I think is correct. I think that an anthropocentric perspective is also a true perspective, which might antagonize some, saying that. I understand, of course, what is meant when various thinkers air the idea that the anthropocentric view of life is a cause for behind many of our troubles, many of the challenges we face, and the destruction of nature and so on and so forth. I understand that, but I think also at the same time that the situation we now find ourselves in is actually a very clear sign that we as human beings are very central to what Christians call creation. And to just round off then, I just put some feelers out here. To round off regarding nature's rights or earth rights, it's kind of an oxymoron actually to me to think in terms of us, human beings, granting nature rights, which is what we do in the legal system, formally and intellectually. But actually it's the other way around. It's all along been nature that has granted us the right to exist. And this has to become fundamental to our thinking. And making these kinds of reflections fundamental to our thinking generally is a truly, truly hard task. And it has to do with what you, Mary, talked about in terms of pushbacks. Because as soon as the very minute you manage to say something, to manifest something, to organize something that actually truly challenges the delusion which we are caught up in, then you feel this pushback. And you have to ask yourself, where the hell does it come from?
I'm not going to speak to the existence of hell, but I wanted to say thank you both. This is a very interesting discussion, and for me it raises the critical question of how does change happen? How does fundamental social change occur? And when we look at movements, whether they're contemporary or whether they're past movements, and when I say movements, I'm talking about things like ending slavery through the abolitionist movement, recognizing the rights of women to vote, the suffrage movement here in Sweden and other places, and other movements that are occurring to attempt to end injustice and oppression, move into protection and recognition of rights. And I say the word recognition of rights because I quite agree with you. We don't grant nature rights, or we don't grant anyone rights. We just finally recognize that they exist. So I think you're quite right on that. But when we think about how fundamental change happens, it's not just that law changes, that legal change occurs. Legal change only happens when culture shifts, when society shifts, how we think begins to shift, our hearts and minds, because law follows culture. And so it's really important to understand how do we create the conditions to change culture, that necessary change in culture which drives the necessary change in law. And that necessary change in law can then further drive culture in the direction that it needs to go. And so it's critically important to understand how cultural change occurs. And the church, of course, has been a central part of culture for millennia. It was the church, of course, and when I say church here, I'm talking like the papal bulls from several hundred years ago, which were signed by the Pope and legitimized the colonialization and domination of European peoples over non-European peoples. And so the church was a fundamental element, legitimizing and legalizing colonialism. So it legalized and legitimized also how we thought about colonialism, how we thought about enslaving, how we thought about oppression, that those things were okay because the people and nature that was being oppressed were treated as other. And the church has been a central role in how we think about other people, how we think about nature, man's domination over nature, our role as stewards in that, over nature, to manage nature. But there's a shift that's occurring, I think, in both Christian churches as well as in other religions, to change how they're thinking about how our relationship is toward nature and our responsibility toward nature. I understand Pella sent me a letter that was recently sent by the bishops of the Church of Sweden regarding climate change and talking about the need to change our understanding of what even stewardship means. That doesn't mean that we are above nature, but that we are part of nature. And perhaps it's time, I would like to think that we can talk about perhaps the bishops would write a public letter about the rights of nature as well and the need to recognize those legal rights. I think there is a shift occurring, and I think the church, I think religion has a really important place in helping to drive and advance that shift. One place where we saw the shift was that Pope Francis several years ago in a speech before the United Nations, in calling for a new era of environmental protection, he said, quote, that rights of the environment do exist. That was a really significant statement by the Pope. And so I think we can begin to see more of that, and I think that we have to look to the two churches as part of a fundamental driver of cultural change that will lead us to the legal change that is necessary to change how we govern ourselves toward nature.
Thank you, all three. And yes, I was going to give the word to you, AnnaKarin, and maybe if you want to say something, because you brought beautifully up these points that you see is so related. So more short term or more concrete, do you see things that church in Sweden could act on?
Yes, I think there are enormous possibilities today in the global network of the church. The church and the Muslims together form more than half of the world's people. So the Muslim religion and the Islam religion and the Christian religion is very important. And 95% of the people of the earth are religious. So don't think that the religion is not important. I would like to pick up on how do we affect social change. The model that I use in analyzing social change is a threefold model. You have direct violence, you have structural violence, and you have cultural violence. And you have to address all three dimensions. Direct violence can be stopped quickly, structural violence takes longer time, but the hardest one to change is the cultural violence. And here comes the religion and the spiritual traditions. And therefore, I agree with you with the colonialism that has been in the upper levels of the church, but there has always been undercurrents, monastic movements like the Franciscans, for example, with St. Francis, that have always cared for the earth and the poor. So you have, when you talk about church, you cannot just talk about the leadership. You have to talk about the movements of the people around the world. And they have never stopped singing and groaning with creation.
Thank you. And I just had an idea as you were speaking. I think of youth, just in Sweden, how church has a very small role. You say, like globally, 90% of the population is religious, but in Sweden, I don't know what we would say the numbers are, but it's low. So do you see what would happen here in Sweden?
I think there is something very interesting religiously in Sweden, because in Britain, for example, people believe, but they do not belong to the church. But in Sweden, they belong, but they don't believe. but there is a connectivity. I think the local church symbolizes that the universe belongs together. The dead and the living, there is a community. And there is a community of all that exists. And at the symbolic level, I think this is deeply ingrained in people in Sweden. So why do we love nature so much in the Scandinavian countries? I think it also has to do with our folk churches. That has always been linked to the territory, because we care not only for people who visit the parish, we care also for the cod and for the reindeer and for all. And of course we have a lot to learn from the Sami people in Sweden. But and there is a whole colonial history that the church is now trying to come to terms with. And but there is a lot in common in respect for all of life. And if we want real social change, we need to change the way we view the world and we experience the world. We need to experience the rivers and the sparrows as sister and brother. Then we will care for them.
Thank you. And on this note of locality, and you mentioned it as territoriality in church, and I'm thinking of it sort of the modern colonialism in terms of global trade that is running without giving us the possibility to see the feedback loops and the consequences on the smaller or regional Lake Erie scale or a global scale. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, Per, the locality and aspect of spirituality.
Well, generally speaking, I would say that non-localized spirituality is no spirituality at all. I think when trying to think about things in this general manner, if I speak for myself, I always try hard, sometimes fail, to put myself into and my own context, social and context of friendship, contexts of work and commitments, and put those actual experience into these kinds of questions. And then I always find that it is actually impossible to philosophize and have an effect. So what does in those concrete circumstances, unless of course it's a discussion where the point of the discussion or the interchange is to ruminate philosophically together in order to reach a certain depth of reflection, which I think is very important. But if you at that depth of reflection sort of forget the actual circumstances and the actual meetings in which you are involved, then you sort of miss the point, and you can talk all night or all week if you like, and you won't accomplish a thing. And I think that has very much to do with how do we affect social change, or for that matter, even, as you said, AnnaKarin, even more difficult cultural change. It has to start there always. We always have to each and every one of us have to ground ourselves where we are at the moment. And even if the context is sort of scientific or legal or artificial in some sense, economic, technological, unless we learn to be present with this feeling of being part of nature, of reality, actually, then we won't feel or experience, once again, the pushbacks. Because speaking of institutions, when I agree that existing institutions of various kinds, legal institutions, government institutions, religious institutions, definitely, because they exist, have a role to play. But I think everyone who has tried to really influence, not just talking, really influence an existing powerful institution of some kind, has come up against this wall of resistance. And that kind of resistance doesn't exist just in the institution. It's a kind of external entity. It exists in myself as well, because I find often that I have internalized aspects of these institutional structures and sort of go along, perhaps too much. So the more people learn, the more we learn, each and every one of us, learn to distinguish the traits in ourselves that make us go along with what the sort of wrong-headed approaches, which is unfortunately manifested in many institutions. We have to sort of be able to see that, take a step back and find the courage to go against it. This I cannot do alone. None of us can do that alone. We have to find we have to find allies in this. So that is why communities and occasions like this one, where we can meet in person, I find are totally crucial. And another aspect regarding institutions and change is that I think it's actually very symptomatic that why won't I call it, the really strong spirit manifesting in protest right now. It's not a coincidence that it comes from young people, children even. So where do they stand in relation to the institutions and the established structures? They are not yet very much part of them. They can still see clearly. People my age, too many of us, have lost that ability and should be extremely grateful to the future existing among us in our children.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of the panel. And you don't close a panel like this by just having a short reflection. So I just wanted us to have a joint breath of spirit, right? Please. Thank you, everyone, and we will continue the conversations throughout the days. Thank you.